right, welcome everybody. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Again, sorry for the delay on there. We're having some some technical difficulties, but I'm really glad that you're all here with us today. So we're going to be running through content on California history from 1900 to 1940. So I hope you find this as interesting as I did. I had the opportunity to learn some new things, and I always like doing that. And I hope you guys do as well. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so these are some of the things that we're going to be taking a look at today. So we'll kind of start with where we've been prior to this. So we're going to be looking at the 1906 earthquake and fire. We're going to learn a little bit about Ansel Adams, the opening of Angel Island, and looking at women's suffrage, so women getting the right to vote, and then looking at some things that were built in California that you might be familiar with, Palace of Fine Arts, Golden Gate Bridge, Bay Bridge, and then we'll look at early films and the Great Depression as well. As always, if you've got questions, feel free to put them in the chat or go ahead and raise your hand. Okay, so kind of our context, or just kind of reminding ourselves of where we've been, is that prior to this point, California had had the gold rush, and so because of that, there were so many people that came to California, and so we're able to grow at a really quick rate because of that. Because of all of this agricultural power we have, things grow really well here, like wheat, things like that. So we have a pretty big economy based on a lot of agricultural products. But then we also get tourism in large part because of the new film industry that has started. So that is the beginning of Hollywood. Okay, so demographics, who was here, how many people were here? So this is always good to look at data. So we start at 1840, so remember before the gold rush, there's about 8,000 people here. Fast forward 10 more years, 1850, our population goes up by a really big amount. So we go from 8,000 to 120,000. And of course that is because of the gold rush. So I included basically all the years that we would be looking at today. So you might be able to zero in on some places where we see big increases. So obviously that jump between 1840 and 1850 is a big one. But then we'll definitely see more if you look at between 1930 and 1940. Another really big jump, and that is because of the Great Depression. So a lot of people start moving out here looking for jobs, and so we'll talk about that a little bit later on in the presentation. Like we talked about before, we still have an insanely high population in California, and if we were our own country, we would be pretty high up in population. Okay, so we're going to start with the 1906 earthquake. All right, so for us Californians, you probably have done earthquake drills in school. If you're not in California, this might be new information for you, but we're basically always preparing for the next big earthquake. So there are a lot of fault lines that run through California. So one of them is the San Andreas Fault. And so this fault slid. So if you know anything about tectonic plates, you have these plates that kind of line up, and then if they shift, then the earth moves. And we see a really big shift here. So this is not just felt in California, it's felt in Nevada, it's felt in Oregon as well. So the Richter scale is the way that we measure earthquakes. And there are little earthquakes all the time. But we generally don't feel them. I would say most people don't feel earthquakes that are less than a 4 or a 5, but this was a pretty big one. So this was an 8.3, so a big tremor. Survivors say that they saw the ground move in waves as high as 3 feet. So imagine just walking outside and just seeing the ground move, and that's pretty scary. It rips open streets, it twists streetcars and trolleys, it splits sidewalks in half. And so initially, they thought that about 100 to 300 people had died. But today we've been able to piece together more evidence. And so the better number today is that 3,000 people, 300,000 people became homeless as a result of this quake. And the vast majority of the town of San Francisco was completely destroyed. So 80% of San Francisco was destroyed. So you've got some images here, so you can see that these buildings are basically off their foundations there. And so then this was the cover of a newspaper in Cincinnati, Ohio. So this was national news, it was international news. So we're going to be hearing in a minute from people who survived the earthquake. So we're going to be talking a fair amount today about primary sources. And hopefully you've talked about primary sources to some extent in your classes before. But basically this just means that these are people that were alive during the event and they're telling about their memories. So as long as it's someone that lived during that time, then they are a primary source. All right, so go ahead and give me an answer in the chat. What historical event are you a primary source for? All right, you've got it. I've got quite a few people saying COVID-19, coronavirus. You got it. This is a pretty wild event that we are living through. And so you are absolutely a primary source for this. So I've shared this on the Facebook page. I will also share this in the chat at the end. But this is something that your parents can print out for you. And you basically can create a time capsule about what it's been like to live through COVID-19, because I guarantee you people in the future are going to want to know what it was like to be a kid during COVID-19 and how we've all really adjusted to not being able to go to school and that sort of thing. So I will definitely share that link again at the end. And you can have your parents print it. All right, got more chat answers there. Okay, so I want us to hear from some survivors. So this is a really quick video, but again, just note that these are primary sources.
The first thing I remember about the earthquake, somebody shook my bed and I landed on the floor screaming.
Dad took us to the top of the Fairmont, and from there we saw four big fires at 10 o'clock in the morning. Big fire. When the earthquake came, those tanks had split, the water went out. They had no water. They just went around blasting things. They decided that they can't put out a fire, and the fire was getting closer to a building, you know. No, nothing much left. All the big buildings were demolished or burned out or no good.
Okay, so you heard from these people. They were definitely pretty old when they were interviewed for this. But part of what they're talking about there, just want to make sure that everyone caught it, is that there was no water. So there were these big fires that start as a result of the earthquake. So basically started from electrical fires from things that had, fallen and broken. And so these fires start and the water mains were empty. So there was no water to put out the fires. And so they just had to let the fire burn. And so if the fire was getting to a building and they wanted to save it, they would blow it up. So they were using dynamite to explode all of these buildings to try to stop the fire from spreading. Okay, and this is what San Francisco looks like on the left. This is what it looked like before the earthquake and the fire, and then this is after. So you can see how different the city looks. So all of these buildings are gone. So one of the few buildings that survives is the US Mint. So you can go there. So what causes this earthquake? So like I mentioned, you've got the San Andreas Fault here that runs through most of California. So the plates are moving a little bit all of the time, but with this earthquake, they moved 15 feet. And normally each year they move about 2 inches. So this was a big movement, and that's why the earthquake was so large. I do want to plug Science Mom. I don't know how many of you have been doing the Science Mom activities, but she is doing a whole lesson today on tectonic plates. So that was perfectly timed, and I think we're going to check that one out later today. And I'll include that in the Facebook page as well. So if you aren't familiar with tectonic plates, this is kind of where they're all mapped out here. So they all have different names, and they all kind of fit together on the globe. And then here you can see the San Andreas Fault and the directions that they were moving there. Okay, so the fires they begin as a result of overturned stoves and electrical equipment. And again, like I mentioned, the water mains are damaged, so there's really no water to fight these fires. And in some places, the temperature reaches 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit, which is insanely hot, which melts glass and metal as well. And so, like I mentioned, it really is out of desperation because there's no water. So the firefighters start just blowing up buildings. But unfortunately, that's going to spread some of the fires. So the fires put themselves out basically after 3 days. And by that point, 28,000 buildings have been destroyed. There's over $500 million in damages. Lots of people died and became homeless. And over 80% of the city is destroyed. Thankfully, a lot of foreign countries and other states start sending a lot of money to try to help us. And you can see Japan gave us a lot. They give about $250,000, which is more than all of the other foreign countries combined. I do want to mention Ansel Adams. Some of you may be familiar with some of his photos. He's a very famous photographer. So he was really well known for photographing places like national parks. So he has some really beautiful images of like Yosemite. And so he was a very young child during the earthquake. He was 4 years old, and he ends up falling into a wall, and he breaks his nose. And so you can see from the image, his nose on the side there is a little bit deformed and dented in, and so he always called it his earthquake nose. So this is Ansel Adams right here, and these are some of his very famous portraits. So this is from Yosemite, and this rose on the driftwood is probably one of his more famous ones as well. So these are all going to be in a document that I will push out to you at the end as well. So if you want to do more on the earthquake or being primary sources, these are activities that I would suggest. If you're interested in photography, you could research more about Ansel Adams, take a look at his pictures, maybe take 2 photos and compare them. I always like to start with Venn diagrams. They always make me feel more organized. You could go to the Earthquake USGS website, and they'll tell you about the latest earthquakes. And so again, they're happening all of the time. So you can find out about that. You can read accounts of survivors. We obviously just saw a very short clip there, but you could compare those too. If there's anything in common, you know, are they all talking about the fires? Are they all talking about how scary it was? That sort of thing. All right, so next topic is Angel Island. So most of us has probably heard about Ellis Island, where most immigrants were coming in, immigrants that were coming from Europe up through Ellis Island. But these are for people coming from the other side. So people coming from Asian nations would be coming through Angel Island, which is just off the coast of San Francisco. So this was a detention center, basically. So people were detained here, partially because of a law passed in 1882 called the Chinese Exclusion Act. So the United States government did not want Chinese people coming into the United States. That lasts for a long time about this, so horribly unfair. And between 10 and 30% of the people that come through Angel Island are sent back. Okay, so if you've got a piece of paper handy, or you can just kind of do this in your head as well if you don't have paper handy, but think about what you would do. So if you were immigrating far away and you were only allowed to take one small suitcase, what would you put in it? So what would you leave behind? So make a list of 4 to 5 objects you would bring. And feel free to share those in the chat as well.
The cat.
Go ahead and type it. Good. Got lots of people saying food and water, blankets, pillows, dolls, something that make you feel safe. See some squishmallows. Oh, good. Linnea said warm and cool clothes. I think that's really smart. Go for Clark. Max, you don't really know where you're going to end up necessarily, so that's really smart. Sleeping bags. Good job, Emmanuel. Good answers. Yeah, and I feel like this is really challenging if you had to, really only limit yourself to 4 to 5 objects. I think that's really tough. Good. All right, great answers here. Okay, so we're going to watch a video here on Angel Island about the Chinese that were sent here.
Angel Island, nicknamed the Guardian of the Western Gate, home to the entryway for immigrants coming to America in hopes of a better life. Located in San Francisco Bay, Angel Island was opened in January 1910. For the next 30 years, it served many purposes, such as serving as military forts and as a U.S. Public Health Service quarantine station, but its original intent was to control Chinese entry into the United States.
It was used for basically detention and the opportunity to question the veracity of whether you were really somebody's son or somebody's daughter.
The purpose of the immigration station was to investigate Chinese who had been denied entry from the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, a U.S. federal law signed by President Chester Arthur that prohibited all immigration of Chinese laborers. Blood relatives of American-born Chinese were among the exceptions to the immigration restrictions. Therefore, Chinese immigrants coined the term paper sons and daughters, referring to the process of buying papers of American-born Chinese as a passageway into America.
My father was born in China, but as far as the government is concerned, he was a native-born Californian. And this is possible, like during the earthquake of 1906, many Chinese with the City Hall records burnt went and applied for native-born citizenship.
From 1910 to 1940, the U.S. immigration station processed hundreds of thousands of immigrants, the majority from China.
It was basically used then as a model after Ellis Island.
Upon arriving at the island, the first landmark is the administration building. Here, men were separated from women and children to be led off for the beginning inspections of the internment process. Having to go through humiliating medical tests, Immigrants have described the examination and disinfection process as brutal, humiliating, and indecent. Alongside medical tests, immigrants had to go through a grueling interrogation process, questioning the most minute details in order to ensure their paperwork for entry into the US was valid. This whole process of interrogation was designed to make it very difficult for the Chinese immigrants to succeed and pass through into America.
Have you ever been known by any other name at any time? Answer, no. How old are you? 39 years, Chinese reckoning.
Separated from family members, they were placed in crowded communal living quarters. 100 persons would sleep in bunk beds, 3 high in columns, in a room about 1,000 square feet. Found along the walls of rooms in Angel Island are poems written by the immigrants detained on the island for months on end. These poems, later translated by scholars such as author Jeff Leong, show an unsparing narrative of what life was like on the island for the immigrants detained behind walls.
They were incarcerated, so they were against their will. So there was not a lot of activities to do. They did things like play, card games, board games, read the newspaper. It was like a prison because they ate at certain hours. They were locked up when they're not, at meals or at exercise. So it was very regulated. They had guards, barbed wire thing. So they took to writing poetry.
The poems themselves are a written testimony to the suffering of the Chinese immigrants and the hardships they faced. The majority of poets were male villagers, often with little formal education from China's southern rural regions.
In Chinese education at that time, and even currently, poetry is actually part of Chinese education.
Couched in classical allegories and historical references, these poems poured forth the aspirations of the immigrants with their anger and sadness at the injustice of their initial reception by America.
Some people just express their loneliness, that they miss their family. And, why did I come all the way over here, taking a ship for 2 weeks and being 3,000-4,000 miles away from the village?
Fear of the other is a common and recurring theme that occurs throughout history. Specifically within the United States, history often repeats itself in how it handles the influx of immigrants who wish to come to America to pursue a better life for themselves and their families. The Chinese who wished to enter America for economic and political success were instead faced with hatred and discrimination. The very reason why Angel Island was built was to prevent and detain Asian immigrants from coming into America.
Poem 23. Detained in the wood house several weeks. It's because of Mexico's exclusion law, which implicates me. It's a pity heroes don't use weapons. I await word to snap Zhu's whip. From here on, I'll travel far from this 2-story building. Each and every villager will share a happiness. Don't idolize everything that's Western style. Even if cut from jade, these walls are nothing but a cage.
Okay, so good info there on Angel Island. So you can still go and visit Angel Island today. In fact, Jake just texted me, and he's going to have a chance to go and spend the night on Angel Island with a school trip. So that's still available. Angel Island was closed for a while. There was a pretty big fire that ripped through Angel Island a few years ago. So they really worked hard to save the remnants of this poetry that had been carved into the walls. And so on your screen, you can see an example. Again, there's just hundreds of these poems carved in Chinese and Japanese characters. So you could get an idea there. So talking about imprisoned in the wooden building day after day, my freedom withheld. So we definitely see that as a common theme with a lot of these poems, of them not being able to leave, of feeling imprisoned and things like that. All right, so these are going to be extension activities that if you want to do these after the lesson, these would be great ways to kind of connect with the content there. So you could write a journal entry like you were someone that was being detained on Angel Island. You could write some free form poetry about that as well. You could illustrate it, but don't carve it into your walls. Like your parents would not be happy about that. If you've got watercolors, you can do a resist watercolor. I don't know how many of you have done that. I know my girls have been doing that a lot since the shelter in place has started. But basically you would take watercolor paper, which is a little bit thicker than normal like printer paper, use a light colored crayon, and you could carve the words of a poem in there and then cover the whole paper with watercolor. And then after it dries, you should see the place where your lighter colors were. So those are ideas. Let's say we're going to move on to women's suffrage. So suffrage means to vote. So we've talked about before, we were talking about the Civil War a couple weeks ago, that's what gives African Americans the right to vote. So people that had formerly been slaves, but that did not apply to women. So women still couldn't vote. Thankfully, California will vote yes on this before it takes a constitutional amendment. So women in California will get the right to vote in 1911. Oops. Sorry. Fix this here. Give me just a second. Not sure what happened there. There we go. Okay. So special election is held. So on October 10th, 1911, California votes to give women the right to vote. So we become just the 6th state to do that. And it wasn't overwhelming by any means. There were a lot of people that still thought women shouldn't have the right to vote. And so 9 years later, the women's right to vote will be made legal nationwide in 1920. So this is a really famous image that I use with my not my homeschool students, my high school students. So these states here that are already filled in, these are the states that could vote before the constitutional amendment. And this woman is bringing votes for women with her lighted torch. So bringing it to all of these women that yet don't have the right to vote. All right, so we'll see a video here on what that fight was like.
Prior to August 18th, 1920, it was a very different America for women. Without the right to vote, they virtually had no rights to their name. All rights were held by men in their lives.
The legal theory is known as coverture. The woman's covered by her father until she marries, by her husband after that. What that meant was that a woman could not own any property that she inherited, any money that she might earn belonged to her husband.
It was in this climate that the push for women's suffrage, or women's right to vote, began. July 1848 was a moment most point to as a launch of the suffrage movement, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott organized the Seneca Falls Women's Convention in New York.
Many people think that's the beginning point. I don't. I go back to 1776. In the spring of that year, Abigail Adams wrote a remarkable letter to her husband, John, who was in Philadelphia debating the Declaration of Independence. And in that letter, she asked him to remember the ladies in your new form of government. And he responds, "You're just a saucy little thing. We're not even going to think about this," and makes a very patronizing joke out of it. I think that Abigail was just articulating what was already in the air. At least one woman was calling for a voice in government, and that's what a vote is.
72 years after Adams' letter to her husband, America was ripe for change. But just as the suffrage movement was gaining momentum, it suffered a setback with the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. The suffragists endured, and by 1917, two main factions within the movement had emerged.
The mainstream wing, headed by Carrie Chapman Catt, and then the radicals, who were very much to the left of the mainstream, headed by Alice Paul. Eventually, this becomes the National Women's Party. And these are the women who, by 1917, are picketing the White House. And they were relentless about it. Now, by today's standards, it was a very genteel, a very decorous, a very polite picketing. They stood silently with banners. But some of those banners had slogans referring to Kaiser Wilson, because he was not going to deal with Alice Paul and the National Women's Party. Eventually, he had to deal with Carrie Catt and the mainstream.
Eventually, President Wilson came out in support of suffrage in 1918. In June 1919, the Senate passed a bill that would become the 19th Amendment. It then went to the states for ratification, where it continued to be an uphill battle in the South.
And it came down to a long, hot summer in Nashville.
In August 1920, pro- and anti-suffragist groups descended on Tennessee for a special session of the state legislature. After much debating, the vote was 48-48. The tiebreaker would be a 23-year-old representative from Tennessee who strongly opposed suffrage.
Harry Byrne was the youngest member of the Tennessee legislature. On the day of the vote, he votes to ratify. People were shocked, stunned on both sides. Nobody expected Harry Byrne to vote as he did. And there were immediate concerns that he had been bought. You know, what happened to make Harry Byrne change his mind?
Byrne had not been bought. He had been persuaded by the most influential woman in his life.
In his coat pocket, he had a letter that he had just received from his 80-year-old mother saying, "Be a good boy, Harry, and if it comes down to your vote, help Mrs. Catt put the rat in ratification." Harry Byrne did what his mother asked him to do.
With that, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify, and the 19th Amendment would be constitutional law.
It is really impossible to overestimate the importance of the 19th Amendment. Women winning the right to vote in the United States signified the first time, and still the only time in the history of the world, where over half of a nation's population won a fundamental right democratically without the use of any violence.
Okay, so good info there. That's one of my favorite historical stories. So Harry Byrne was ready to vote no against giving women the right to vote, and then he gets a telegram from his mother saying, "Do the right thing, son, and help women get the vote." So that's why the 19th Amendment is passed, because her. Yes, we've got a question. Callie?
Why wouldn't they allow women to do anything?
Oh, good question. So some of it was just kind of old beliefs that women weren't as smart as men, that they couldn't make their own decisions, which of course we know today is ridiculous. And it just wasn't seen as necessary. Some people were worried that women would just vote the way that their father told them to vote, or if they were married, what their husband told them to vote. So that was kind of the reasoning, which seems very silly to us today, right? We know that women are smart and we can research things and all of that. Yeah, good question.
Thank you.
Okay, 1915, on to our next event. So this is the Palace of Fine Arts. is built. This is, if you've ever driven through San Francisco, you've probably driven right past this building, and it is a beautiful building. So right around the turn of the century, we build the Panama Canal. So through Panama, so that now you'll be able to sail your ship basically through Central America instead of going all the way around the tip of South America. So this was to celebrate this achievement. And so there were these Pan Am expositions all over the country. If you've ever been to the San Diego Zoo in Balboa Park, that was another Pan Am exposition. And so ours is late. So we don't do ours until 1915 because of all of the damage from the earthquake. But so this is the Palace of Fine Arts. So again, if you've driven through San Francisco, you're probably familiar with this site. It's a lovely, lovely building. So there were 10 different palaces that were built for the Pan Am Exposition. And this is the only one that stays up because the people of San Francisco just fell in love with it. So it stays up. And so the theme was of a Roman ruin, kind of mutilated and overgrown. And so it's been used in a lot of different ways over the years, I think are pretty fascinating. So initially it was home to an art exhibit. So there were big murals up on the inside of the dome. It was home to 18 tennis courts at one point. During the World Wars, it was storage for Jeeps and trucks. It's been a telephone book distribution center. You probably don't even have those anymore, but we used to pass around telephone books, know who to call. It's been a fire department headquarters. And today it is a park. But interesting, during our current pandemic, so during this COVID-19, it has now been turned into a shelter for people that are homeless. So it is being used right now as a way to help people during this. But the problem with the building is it wasn't designed to last. It was really just designed for this fair, this Pan Am Fair. And so it starts falling apart. So by the 1950s, it really did look a mess. And so they had to fix it. And so in the 1960s, it is torn down, as you can see some of the images there, and they rebuild it using steel beams, and then they retrofit it for earthquakes as well. So World War I happens in 1914, although the United States doesn't get involved until later. So thousands of California men and women would contribute to the war effort. Walt Disney gets involved. So he really wanted to join the army, but he was too young. So he joins as a Red Cross driver. So he does go to Europe. So basically like an ambulance driving around. But California's biggest contribution to the war was the aircraft industry. So California has always been home to a really big aircraft industry, partially because of our weather. We don't get a ton of rain or big weather problems, so you can work on planes year round. There was also a group of women called Hello Girls. And so they're basically operators. So these are women, they were looking for women in particular that were bilingual. So they're looking for women that can speak both French and English. So they send them to Europe so that they can field the calls between the English and the English speaking and the French speaking forces in World War I. So California contributes the most out of any state. So 37 of them come from California out of about 200 total. So we're gonna move on to the film industry. Callie is super excited. She's been waiting for this. So we just recently watched Hugo Cabret, and so this image plays a pretty big role there. So films had been around for a while, but they're not what we would associate with as a movie. So most of them are under a minute long. And so sometimes it would just be like imagery of a baby eating or a horse running. So they were very simple. There was no recorded sound until 1927. So these are called silent films. So they're often live musicians in the theater that would complement the film and make it more exciting. But it was always up to the musicians about what they were going to play. So it wasn't necessarily what the filmmaker designed. Okay, Callie, you have a question?
It's in the book, I just read that. There's one movie that it talked about that is just a train pulling into the station, and it's the first one of its kind. It's just a train pulling into the station, but all the people were sitting there, and it looked like the train was going straight for them. That's why they were so scared.
Right. Yeah. So it's new to a lot of people, and so they think the train is actually coming into the theater. So they all try to duck out of the way because this is a really new medium. So special effects, again, probably not what we would consider special effects today. We're so spoiled with our CGI, our computer generated effects now. But so the name to associate with that is Georges Méliès, and so he was a very early filmmaker, and he was just doing some wild stuff. And so that's his image there of from a film called A Trip to the Moon. So really cool stuff. So that's our little plug to go watch Hugo Cabret, because Méliès plays a pretty big role in that. So in the early 20th century, the film industry was actually in New Jersey. It was nowhere near California. And so these are some of the early known actors in the silent film age. Okay, so we've got Mary Pickford, and this is Buster Keaton, Rudolph Valentino, who was oh my gosh, everyone was in love with Rudolph Valentino. He ends up dying pretty young, and women and men as well, are just distraught. Like, people are fainting when they hear that he's died. So people were really in love with him. So this is him from a film called The Sheik. And then Charlie Chaplin there in the hat and the mustache. So he's definitely the most well-known out of all of them. You might be able to tell just from these photos that because they're silent films, they have to act a lot with their face, right? So it can't be based on the words coming out of their mouth, because no one can hear the words that are coming out of their mouth. Now, when they're being filmed, they would still be moving their mouths, and then they would stop the scene and a card would come up on screen that would list the dialogue or important information for each person. So if we have time, I think we'll come back to this. I'm going to make sure that we get through all of the content first, but this is fun stuff in there too. All right, so I want you to take a minute and do summary practice. Okay, so see what you remember. If you want to write it down, that's fine. If you want to put it in the chat for me, feel free to do that as well. Okay, so what were early films like? Good, I've got some good comments here. They were silent. They were very different from our films. Have to use their face to act. They're in black and white. Good. All right, good stuff. All right, so why Hollywood? So why does the film industry move to Hollywood? So one reason is the land was really cheap. So in 1915, it was very easy to attain land, especially in Southern California. And we have a variety of locations. So, within an hour drive, you could be at the beach, you could be at the desert, you could be in the mountains. So this was great for filmmakers that wanted a variety of different locations. Also, it was as far away from New Jersey as possible. So there was one man that was in charge of the movie industry, and that was Thomas Edison. His name is probably familiar to you if you know anything about the light bulb and electricity and that sort of thing. So he really was very restrictive about this industry. So he was holding patents. So if you hold a patent, it means that you have this invention basically, and no one else can use it without your permission. And so he only wanted his movie studios to be making movies. So he had even gotten the people at Kodak, people that make the physical film that it was being filmed on, that they had to get Thomas Edison's permission to even sell film. But if you were in California, you were pretty far away from New Jersey. So he holds thousands of patents over the course of his life. He is credited with the kinetoscope, which is an early film camera, but we know today that he actually did very little of the work on that invention. It was really his assistant and his employee, William Dixon, who had done most of the work on that, even though Edison was given credit for it. So in this time period, so again, he's holding most of the patents, and the place where you would go and see these very short films were called Nickelodeons. If you've heard of that network, Nickelodeon, if you're fans of SpongeBob, then you're familiar with that name Nickelodeon. And so that's where that name comes from, that you would pay a nickel, and then you would be able to go in and watch a bunch of those films. So California is very far from New Jersey. It's about as far as you can possibly get and still be within of the United States. And so he is not able to enforce the patents in California. And in some cases, he's sending mobsters to try to enforce his will. And so if they do make it to California, basically people would just hide in Mexico. So they would cross the border to escape Thomas Edison. But by the 1930s, the movie industry is the biggest industry in the United States. So this becomes really important when the Great Depression hits. So the Great Depression hits in 1929. Lots of people lose their jobs. 25% of all Americans were unemployed during the Great Depression. Banks are failing, businesses are failing. So it's a really hard time. And so films end up being a really important escape for people. So this is when we get some of our most beloved movies, like Walt Disney's first feature-length film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, comes out in the early 30s. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Gone with the Wind, The Wizard of Oz. And so those are some that you're probably familiar with, a couple of those already. And so it really is escapism for a lot of people. All right, so we're gonna watch a video here on the Great Depression and the importance of film.
Unemployment insurance, no, nothing. We're on your own.
By 1931, hard times seemed to be everywhere. But if you could still spare a dime, you could slip into a glamorous world where the roaring 20s had never ended.
You could go to the Grand Lake Theater, hear Horace Heidt and his orchestra play for half an hour. And then they'd have the movie-tone news. And then they'd have the feature story. And then they would have Bugs Bunny or the equivalent comic. And then they'd have the second feature. By that time, the orchestra was getting ready to play again. You could spend about 6 or 7 hours for 15 cents.
There was no television, there was only radio. So this visual escape into a dark theater, you could literally forget your troubles and get happy.
Many people tried to dance their troubles away, often to the carefree, irresistible rhythms of a new generation of jazz music that was sweeping the country. Swing.
Swing it, honey child. Susie Q's going to town and how.
Now meet Richard Culver as Boston Blackie. Enemy to those who make him an enemy. Friend to those who have no friend.
Many more were transfixed by the gripping dramas of radio. During the Depression, the radio was the one appliance people could not live without.
I used to watch the radio. It was like turning on television. There was the shadow.
Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The shadow knows.
Turn off the lights. We're going to clean them out today.
You didn't know that they were standing on a stage reading from scripts. You just thought they were doing it.
All right, boys, let's hit out.
What I liked most was to go into my room and turn off all the lights. I didn't want any interference and just listen to it. My father thought I was a little weird, and he'd always come in and turn the lights on and say, "What's wrong with you?" And I said, "Nothing's wrong with me. This is really wonderful, a great way to listen to it."
But sooner or later, people had to turn the radio off. They had to leave the movie theater. And when they did, the Depression was still there, waiting. It advanced upon the farmers of the South and Midwest in terrifying storms of dry dust. It was one of the worst droughts in American history. The land itself was blowing away.
It looked like a tornado coming, big black clouds, dust coming across the desert there. It was terrible. You couldn't breathe. You'd put something over your face, a handkerchief, and try to breathe through it. You spit out mud balls.
25,000 square miles of farmland became known as the Dust Bowl. For farmers who'd been suffering through their own economic crisis since the 1920s, it was the final blow. Leaving their farmhouses and barns to rot, they fled westward for the promised land, California.
Okay, so that gives us some more info on the Great Depression. So it's setting us up there. So the Great Depression is one of the greatest economic catastrophes that ever happened. So it starts in October 1929. The stock market crashes, banks are closing because too many people were trying to get their money out all at the same time. And so again, like I mentioned earlier, we have very high unemployment. So 16 million Americans were unemployed. And so I want to show you just a brief video clip here for my fans of Mary Poppins. I actually do show what a bank run looks like.
Give it back! Give me back the money!
Michael, Michael, behave! Michael, behave! Jay!
There's something wrong. The bank won't give someone their money. Well, I'm going to get mine. Come along, young man. Every penny in your mine, too.
And give me mine, too. Stop all payments! Stop all payments!
Okay, so that's kind of the idea, is that everyone would line up and try to get their money out all at once. So this bank shuts everything down. So that just gives you an example. So some important images from this time period. So you'd see signs like this: outside of cities, jobless men keep going. We can't take care of our own, especially for areas like California, because a lot of people were coming to California to try to find jobs. So this is, if you were to decide on the most important photo from the Great Depression, this is it. So this is called Migrant Mother. It's taken by Dorothea Lange. She had actually been a student of Ansel Adams, who we talked about earlier. So this is a woman that's been impacted by the Dust Bowl. So you saw the imagery of that from the video. And so very few jobs to go around though. So they could pack up everything they own, make it to California, and then there's no jobs. So that's really tough. So imagery of the Dust Bowl here. So you can't live in this. I mean, you can't go outside, anything like that. So the land was literally blowing away because there had been drought for so long, and then these big storms come in and just pick everything up in its path. And so these people were called Okies. So a lot of them were coming from Oklahoma, so that's how they get that nickname. And so a lot of cities won't even let them in their borders. And so they set up these kind of makeshift houses. Okay, so this is a billboard that was in California. No jobs in California. If you're looking for work, keep out. This is Route 66. So this is the road that people were taking to get from the Midwest to California. It's a very historic road that you can still go on today. So it takes you to Los Angeles. Okay, so do some sequence practice. Again, if you've got paper in front of you, that's great. Or if you want to do it in the chat, you can do that as well. So what happened first? What happened next in terms of the Great Depression? If you've got questions about that, feel free to pop up your hand or ask a question in the chat. Again, I'm seeing some good examples in the chat. Stock market crashed, banks closed, Dust Bowl happens. Okay. All right, so that would be a good example of good sequence. So the crash happening, leading to the run on the banks, businesses failing, banks failing, high unemployment. Okay. All right, nice job. All right, so 1936, the Bay Bridge opens. So this is important to us local folks for sure. So this was a way to connect Oakland, which was a big trade center. So you have ports in both of those cities. And so it would be easier if we could connect both of those so we could move material if we wanted to and needed to. So that opens in November of 1936. And these bridges, as they open, so the Golden Gate and the Bay Bridge will open within 6 months of each other. So these are just technological marvels. I mean, people really thought this was impossible to achieve. So just the sheer amount of manpower it takes, the amount of material, steel, all of that is really impressive with what they use here. So this bridge is over 8 miles long. And it's 180 feet above the water, and they have to sink these piers between 50 and almost 250 feet below the water. So pretty amazing kind of things going on here, and very expensive. It's a different design from the Golden Gate because the distance between San Francisco and Oakland was bigger. So that's the Bay Bridge. All right, and the original plan was to have cars on the top level and trains on the bottom, but as more and more people start driving cars rather than taking trains, then they redesign it in 1958. So there are 5 lanes of car traffic on each deck. But as you can see from the image there, it was damaged pretty heavily during the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, and we'll talk more about that next week. But that top level you can see just collapsed. So a piece of it fell down, and so some of the cars that were on there fell down there as well. So it had to be fixed. And so just some images here of setting it up. So I just think this would be so scary to work on these projects. So high up in the air there. All right, and then the Golden Gate Bridge opens just a few months later. So this is an idea that had been proposed quite early on, but it doesn't really get much traction until 1916, 1917. Most people thought that this was impossible. It couldn't be done. But Joseph Strauss, who had done 400 other bridges, thought that it could. And so he starts working on it. And then it's completed and open to pedestrian traffic on May 27th, 1937. And then it will open up to vehicles the next day.
The Golden Gate Bridge stands today as an international icon, a symbol of innovation, stick-to-itiveness, what man could do during a very difficult time in our history.
Before San Francisco's landmark bridge was built, a mile stretch of Pacific Ocean, known as the Golden Gate Strait, separated the majestic city by the bay and neighboring Marin County. And the most practical way for commuters to get from one side to the other was by boat. In the 1920s, an engineer named Joseph Strauss and his team began working on a plan to change that. The only thing that stood in their way: high winds, strong currents, dense fog, the occasional earthquake, and the single largest economic depression the country had ever experienced. Piece of cake. It took over a decade, but Strauss finally got his plan approved and convinced the people in the community to cough up the $30 or so million he needed to begin construction.
They were so enthused at this innovation that they agreed in November of 1930 to back the bonds to build the Golden Gate Bridge. That meant they put their farms, their vineyards, their homes, their businesses up as collateral to back the Golden Gate Bridge construction.
It also didn't hurt that the founder of the Bank of America agreed to back the project in an effort to boost the local economy. Construction began January 5th, 1933. And in no time, men with little experience in the skilled trades became high-flying, death-defying bridge builders. Workers moved tons of dirt and rock to make way for almost 200,000 cubic yards of concrete needed to build the bases. Others became adept at manipulating newly forged steel. It was an impossible job, with hazards too many to count. But on this project, potential dangers were met head-on.
Strauss was the man that implemented a number of safety measures for the first time on a major construction project in this country. Hard hats, safety nets, special cream for the wind, pills for the dizziness. He really took to heart the safety measures, and it saved a tremendous number of lives.
While 11 men did perish, those nets prevented another 19 from plummeting to their deaths, earning each one membership into the exclusive fraternity known as the Halfway to Hell Club. What the engineers dreamed up and workers then built was nothing short of a miracle. The foundations are earthquake-proof, dug deep into the bedrock to support the giant, almost 900,000 tons of steel. A staggering 1.2 million rivets were hammered into each tower, which in turn support the two main cables. Cables that are 36 inches in diameter, and inside each of those, 80,000 miles of wire, enough to crisscross the country 13 times. As a finishing touch to the stylish Art Deco design, the bridge was painted a now famous international orange, deemed the perfect complement to the surrounding landscape. In 1937, the impressive span was completed and opened amidst massive fanfare. Over 200,000 people showed up to walk across the improbable structure, forged out of Pennsylvania steel and the sweat of determined men.
The men that built the Golden Gate Bridge had hearts as big as the Golden Gate Bridge and pride as tall as the Golden Gate Bridge towers. They were an incredible group of men that were so thankful to have a job, to feed their families, to be able to build what became an international icon. It's the bridge built by the people, for the people.
Okay, so there's info on the Golden Gate Bridge for you. And probably the most distinctive piece of this bridge is the color. So there is only one international orange. There are people all the time that try to replicate this color, but it's a very special paint that is made only for the Golden Gate. And so they have to touch it up almost constantly, and partially because of the salt spray that comes off of the ocean damages the paint really quickly. So an incredibly dangerous job, as you can see just how high up this man is. So this man in particular has worked on the bridge for almost 30 years. And those winds can get really high. And if you've ever been to San Francisco, you know how foggy it is. So it's fogged in about 70% of the time. So really, really tough job there. All right, and that is the end. So these are all of the extension ideas here. So I do want to just kind of draw your attention to these worksheets here, and I will drop these in the chat here so that you can use those. So I think these would be really fun, and I'd love to see what you come up with. So I'll drop these in the chat. And I'll be hanging out for a little bit. So if you have questions, please let me know. I'll be hanging out for a bit.
Yeah.
And so let me know if you have questions about any of that. Feel free to pop your hand up. Again, check out those, the Google Doc there. And thanks for joining us today, and we'll pick up where we left off next time. So we'll start with World War II, and we will go from there. I hope to see some examples of maybe some art or writing. So again, have your parents send it to me on the Facebook page or anything like that.
Bye, Maria. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for joining us, you guys. Hope you learned some new stuff.
Bye. Thank you.
No problem. Have a good rest of your day. All right, it looks like there aren't any questions, so I'll go ahead and end the meeting, and hopefully you guys will join us next week and have a good rest of your week.